Today is a national holiday in honor and commemoration of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and the work of the civil rights movement to secure racial justice and equality in the United States. When we think about the civil rights movement, we often think about it with the images or the stories that are fixed in our heads from middle school. Rosa Parks sat down on a bus, she wouldn't get up, the Montgomery bus boycott was launched, there was marching in the streets and singing, and then eventually the United States achieved racial justice. And that picture is a considerably oversimplified one. So in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I'd like to raise 3 corrective points to that simplified picture that we may be carrying around with us since middle school. The first point is about what the civil rights movement was fighting against. The second point is about how it fought, and the third point is about who fought. So first, let's talk about what it was fighting against. We sometimes think of segregation as being black people had to sit in the back of the bus, white people could sit in the front. Black people and white people couldn't use the same water fountain. And that significantly understates the scope, the reach, and the evil of the segregation system. What the segregation system really was in the United States South was a system in which there was democracy, but only for some citizens. If you were a white person living in the South, you were living under a democracy. If you were a black person living in the American South, you were living under a system of rule in which you had no voice, you couldn't vote, you couldn't participate, you couldn't serve on a jury, and most importantly, where the state would not protect you. If an African American was subject to violent assault, it would be very likely that their white attacker wasn't brought to trial at all, or if the white attacker was, they would be quickly acquitted by an all-white jury. There were thousands of cases over the decades from the end of the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement of lynching in the American South. Thousands of people killed, and that went on with impunity. There was no punishment for these lynchers. The argument always was that it wasn't known who was responsible for the lynching, even when, as in many cases, the lynching was a public event with tens, hundreds, or thousands of participants and witnesses. Even then, nobody was ever punished for lynching. And so it's important to realize that when we talk about the system that existed in the American South, we don't just mean different water fountains, we mean a system in which the safety, the bodies, the lives of African Americans were not protected by the state from violence, and in which they had no ability to participate in the government, to reshape the government, to call on the state to protect them. So that's what they were fighting against. Next, in terms of how they fought, we're all familiar with the idea that Dr. King's strategy was nonviolent civil disobedience. What we may not realize is that that nonviolent civil disobedience drew on 2 strands. The first strand was a philosophical strand, originated with the American Transcendentalists, channeled through Mahatma Gandhi in India fighting for Indian independence from the British, and then from there to Martin Luther King, where he shaped that or inflected it with his own Christian understanding of what he termed in the March on Washington the redemptive value of unearned suffering. That if you suffer for no reason, that actually in and of itself has religious and redemptive value. But there was another strand in their thinking as well. And the other strand in their thinking as well was that there weren't enough African Americans in the United States, and they didn't have enough clout to advance their agenda legislatively. The only way they were going to get done what they needed to get done was with the support of whites in the North. And they realized that whites in the North would be likely to rally around them and be supportive if they saw horrifying pictures like the ones we're so familiar with of unarmed black protesters being set upon by police dogs, by fire hoses, being attacked by the mob. And so in part, the use of nonviolence was a product of deep commitments, both philosophical and religious, but in part, the use of nonviolence was a deeply canny and strategic media approach to how they could best accomplish their goals. We may not like to think of the civil rights movement as being canny and strategic as much as they were motivated by profound moral considerations, but that's the case. The third thing I want to talk about is who did the fighting. This may sound like a funny thing to say on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but it really wasn't just Martin Luther King. He was a very important figure, and he's the one we remember, whose words we quote, and whose picture we know. But the civil rights work was really done by many, many, many thousands of people taking to the streets. Many of them were young. They were teenagers, they were high school students, they were college students who were out there marching, who were doing the freedom rides, who were staging the sit-ins, who were willing to be arrested, and at least potentially, and sometimes actually, face serious violence for what they were doing. There were also many others. There were the lawyers fighting in the courts, and that was something that predated what we think of as the civil rights movement. Remember the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education to say that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional was handed down in 1954, before the Montgomery bus boycott ever got started. There were the veterans of World War II, African American veterans, who said, we fought against Hitler and we were told that he was terrible because he discriminated against people and he hurt people based on who they were and how they were born. And then we come back home to the United States and in our uniforms we're told to sit on the back of the bus? That doesn't work. And so there were many, many groups of people in all walks of African American society and in white society, in many different ways and from many different vantage points, who stood up to the fundamental injustice and evil of the system that we have described in order to achieve what Dr. King described in his March on Washington address as asking America to live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.